so glad that you joined us this week for our final week in our Gospel Community series. Actually, we want to begin this week by apologizing for a mix-up. I told you that this week was going to be our Commitment Sunday, and we were going to do some different events and different things surrounding that. And it's nobody's fault but mine. I completely just got our calendar mixed up. That's going to be next weekend. This is the final week in our series. This is always supposed to have been the final week in our series. But I got our Commitment Sunday mixed up. That's supposed to be next week, right before the Thanksgiving holiday. And then this week is just our normal services as usual, as you're probably finding out about right now. All right. So sorry about that. I will say, just as a bit of exciting news, hopefully, we're going to try and do our Commitment Sunday down at our facility next week. Now, the deal with that is it's an active construction site. There's a lot going on. It's not at all put together. It's super messy. But it would be nice to have everyone together in one place and be able to do our services down there. The deal with that is that we will have to wear masks, and there's some up and down about whether or not we're actually going to have it done enough to meet down there in time. As it turns out, we may have that decision made for us if the governor decides to sort of change things around and move us back a phase or something like that. So I say all of that to say just be looking out and be paying attention for word that will be coming out this week about that, about whether or not we can actually meet down there and do our services down there or what. And if we do that, we'll probably put out some form of an RSVP. That is incredibly important that you RSVP back to us and let us know that you're going to be there. So how many chairs we need to get gathered up, kids ministry, all those sorts of things will absolutely hinge on whether or not you RSVP on to that invitation to that service here coming next weekend. So I think that's all the announcements that we had really going into this. And so enough of that. So there's this sort of running joke that a lot of people know, and as soon as I say this, just if you're not already in the loop in this, look around the room, and those people are going to be rolling their eyes, right? Because this is something that I've talked about a lot, and this is sort of a big running joke. And it actually has to do with my yard. And this is probably the most dad thing that I do. I don't know what your dad thing is or what your dad's dad thing was, but I just have to imagine that he had something that he did that was like the most dad thing he did. And this is mine. This is like what I do. And it usually goes something like this. Is we'll be hanging around the house, and I will walk past a window or cracked blind, and I'll stop and I'll say, "Oh my gosh, Danielle!" And everybody in the house like perks up and jumps into action, and they run over the window, and I say, "My yard looks amazing." And then I usually have to like dodge a haymaker or a shoe or something at that point, right? And my favorite time to do this is if we're like in a huge rush, getting out the door. We're like scrambling, got our arms full. I will like wait till we're all at the door, and I'll stop and I'll say, "Oh my word!" And I'll like search my pockets for a second, and everybody, what did we forget? And it's like, forgot that my yard looks amazing. And so again, dodge haymaker, dodge shoe, right? That's like sort of the running joke. I do love my yard. I love mowing. I love smelling the grass clippings. I love waging war against the evil empire of the dandelions, right? Like my yard is my happy place. It gives me a lot of joy to be out there. I know that that's not the case for everyone. Some people they hate yard work, and even thinking about going out into the yard and working is just like terrible. Not for me. I really enjoy working in my yard. Now here's the deal. If you're in my house today watching this expedition group, or you've been to my house in the last 8 months, I don't know, however long COVID has been happening for, then you know that I should be proud of my yard, right? Because right now, the dandelions have taken the western front, and it looks like I am going for like the Addams Family look or something. Like my yard is not looking good, which is kind of crazy because I had these aspirations whenever the whole COVID thing happened. Like when we really realized what this was going to be and that it was going to like drag on. It's like, man, we're going to be home like from school, like no kids in school. Like we're not going to work. Like, dude, this is amazing. I'm going to have so much time for activities on my hands. And so I had all these like huge aspirations. Like I was going to come out of COVID just like shredded nasty. And I was going to have like this craziest thought ran through my mind at one point that I was going to train for a marathon, right? And even saying it out loud right now, it sounds insane. And then I wanted to have like the best yard in the neighborhood, right? Like there's one lady and she always has a nicer yard than me in our neighborhood, Miss Claire. But I wanted to have like Disney World level yard. I don't know if you've ever been to Disney World, but the grass is amazing there, right? Did anybody else have those like aspirations? Maybe not those same ones, but like when COVID hit and like it was aware of like we were aware of like what it was going to look like, and we were going to be home from work or whatever was going on. It was like, dude, I can finally get to and do some things that I've wanted to do, right? How are those working for you? Anybody? Good? Bad? No. Right? Like I'm 10 pounds heavier, like not in a good way. I've ran 0 times at this point. And again, my yard looks like I'm going for the Addams family. Look, it's grown up around me, right? I didn't get the rest, and I didn't stop and take the knee and take the time that I thought I was going to have over this season, right? Like this is unprecedented in our lifetimes, and I was expecting a lot more downtime and a lot more time, and it's actually been the opposite of that. It's been less rest, it's been more rush, less margins, right? And because of that, some things that I really love and some things that I really enjoy doing have went by the wayside. Now, my family, consequently, is actually really happy because I haven't like walked past the window and did my dad thing in a while, right? But it's because my yard is suffering during this time. Here's the deal. That sounds like the introduction you would give for a sermon about rest. And we are going to talk a lot about rest today. We're going to talk about stopping and resting and how absolutely important that is, because there are important things that we should be about and we should be doing that a lot of times get pushed to the margins of our lives. But today, actually at the end of today, it isn't about rest. In fact, the title of today's sermon is for us to be a community of worship, or to be a community who worships. And as what I realized as I started studying for this topic of worship this week is that the ideas of rest and worship, that they're not mutually exclusive things that aren't related in scriptures. That rest and worship are actually tied at the hip at every corner, everywhere you turn in the Bible. These two ideas are directly linked together, and they're inextricably linked. Like you cannot separate these two ideas. And so, I would say that who's ready to be uncomfortable this morning, right? I know that I have been. That this is an area of incredible conflict, just even within my own soul. I kind of gave you this disclaimer a few weeks ago when we talked about the subject of prayer. And I said that, man, I struggle in this area of prayer. I have my own hangups, my own issues. Like I am learning and growing and like growing in maturity in this area. And this area is no different, right? The area of worship, especially when it comes to this idea that rest is directly connected to our worship and directly affects and hinders or allows for our worship. That this is a major area of conflict for me, like internally. And not just that, but this is a major area of conflict in my marriage. I don't mean like we're having serious marital issues over this, but I mean that this has been something that she has noticed, Danielle has noticed in me, and that others around me have noticed, that I struggle in this area. And so I just want you to know that I don't speak from a position of like moral superiority on this topic, right? Like I have my own issues that I'm working through, but I would say like I think this is a conflict that we all need to engage in, because just like in a marriage, conflict that is rooted in trust and love and an overall hope and concern for our growth and maturity is good conflict, and it's conflict that we need to enter into. And so when I say who's ready to get uncomfortable, I hope that we would all be ready to get uncomfortable this morning around this subject, right? So we've been in this gospel community series for a few weeks now, and this is actually our last week of the series again. Next week is going to be our wrap-up, our Commitment Sunday. And we've been talking about how the gospel shapes us over this area of just being a church. Like, how does the gospel shape us into the rhythms and the habits and the things that we care about and the things that we do and that we're working towards. And this week we're gonna talk about that over the area of worship. Now, worship is an incredibly huge topic, and my tendency is to try to talk about all of a topic. And if I can't talk about all of a topic, then it really makes me uncomfortable, and I have a hard time doing that. And so I can't do that with this, because literally the entire Bible is about worship. The Bible isn't about like heaven and hell and how you escape one and go to the other. The Bible isn't about a good moral code. It isn't like the compass that leads us through life. It's none of those things. At the end of the day, the Bible is about God revealing himself to us. And the ultimate like revelation of God's character to us is in the person of Jesus. And it's as we see Jesus for who he is, for what he's done, for how he has loved us and sacrificed on our behalf, that it inspires worship for the unseeable, unknowable God, that now all of a sudden is seeable and is knowable in the person of Jesus. And we can actually worship in light of who he is and what he's done. That's what the Bible's about. Worship is all of our life, right? It isn't about like growing in moral superiority and in like being a better Christian year after year, right? Like that's not at the end of the day what it's about. It's about growing maturity into the image of Jesus, ultimately so that we can recognize him for who he is and worship God in light of his character and for who he is, right? It's our mission. It's our jobs. It's everything that we do, and everything around us is pointing to and is leading to the worship of God. And so this is, it's actually at its root a fairly simple topic, but it's not a small topic, and it's definitely not an easy topic. It's such a big topic that we're not going to cover all of it this week, right? Worship is the odd response to the saving acts and praiseworthy character of God. That's what worship is, and I want to begin with that definition as we move towards this idea of how rest and worship are connected. I want us to start with a good definition of what worship is. Worship is the odd response to the saving acts and praiseworthy character of God. Namely that our God is the creator of all things, right? From the entire universe and everything in it, to our sun that gives us warmth and light, right? And makes our plants grow that produce oxygen, to the magnificent painted sunsets that we experience regularly here in the Pacific Northwest, right? That our God is the creator of both of those things. And he's the creator of that little lizard in some faraway desert that is climbing to the top of a sand dune right now to soak up the last of the sun's warmth before a cold night, right? And as we come to realize all that God has done and how awesome and wonderful he is as our creator, that we worship him in light of this. Our God is always present, and he sustains all things, right? Man, he is just as present and aware of the subatomic exchange of energy in the heart of some star 100 billion light years across our universe, as he is present and aware in the thoughts that are racing through your mind at this very moment, right? And he sustains both of these constantly. You know, I heard a science talk. It was a science and religion talk one time. A guy talked about the amount of energy that the earth has and produces. And he says, man, that if we took all of the potential energy that the earth has to offer, man, and we were somehow able to like connect a power line from the earth to the sun, if the sun ever went out, we would only power the sun for around 3 seconds before it would flicker and go out. That's like, and yet God sustains not just our sun, but billions and trillions of stars and planets and things all across our galaxy, and he is worthy of our worship. Man, our God is the perfect embodiment of love. So much so that one biblical writer tells us that God is love, right? Our God, he took off his godly form to put on the broken and weak form of his created humans, to enter into our mess, to be tempted in all the ways that we are, to experience our pain, our rejection, and ultimately our punishment, just to reconcile a relationship. Man, there are times when I won't even say sorry when I know I'm wrong to reconcile a relationship, right? Our God is worthy. Our God sits on a throne of unapproachable light. He is surrounded by creatures that were specifically created to survive in the unbridled presence of his glory. And yet, they still have to cover themselves and protect themselves from his radiance. I love what Francis Chan says. He says, "Isn't it a comfort to worship a God that we cannot exaggerate?" Man, our God deserves all glory and honor and reverence. And our worship is a recognition of that. Our worship is done in a response to who he is and what he's done. And to worship our God requires the full spectrum of our emotions and our full intellect. It requires our complete devotion of our entire lives and the fullest expression of love that we can give. And yet, we often relegate our worship to this God to the space of 3 songs before a sermon once a week. Man, I don't have to explain why that is less than acceptable in light of this God. And so this week, I want to answer the question, how does the gospel shape us into a community of worship? True worship. Worship that, as Jesus said, happens in spirit and in truth. And interestingly enough, I think the answer to that question is found in bread and birds, right? Bread and birds. So if you have your Bible, let's go look. And we're not going to start in Acts this week. We're going to end in Acts. We've been studying through the book of Acts. This week we're going to start in the book of Exodus. So Exodus chapter 16, verse 13 through 30. Bread and birds. Here we go. You ready? It says, "So it came about at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. And when the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' Right? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to him, 'It is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece,'" so that's just a measuring cup worth, a piece, "according to the number of persons each of you has in his tent." Now the sons of Israel did so, and some gathered much, and some gathered little. And when they measured it with an omer, that measuring cup, the one who had gathered much, he had no excess, right? And the one who gathered little, he had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. Moses said to them, though, 'Let no man leave any of it until the morning.' But they didn't listen to Moses, did they? And some left of it until the morning. And it bred worms, became foul, it smelled bad, right? And Moses was angry with them. So they gathered it in the morning, or they gathered it morning by morning, every man as much as he should eat. But when the sun grew hot, it would melt. Now, on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, 'This is what the Lord meant,' right, when he told you to gather twice as much. He said, 'Tomorrow is a Sabbath. It's a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning,' right? He just told us not to keep any till morning, but now he's telling us to keep some until morning on this specific day. So they put it aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it didn't become foul. It didn't stink. There wasn't any worm in it, right, like it was the other days. On this day, something was different. Moses said, 'Eat it today, for today is the Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none.' It came about on the 7th day that some of the people, though, they didn't listen or whatever, they went out to gather, but they didn't find any. And then the Lord said to Moses, 'How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you bread for 2 days. On the 6th day, remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day.' So the people rested on the 7th day." There it is. Birds and bread. You guys get it, right? No, what in the world, right? And this is actually jumping into the middle of a story, a much bigger story that I didn't have time to tell. But something profound happens in this that I think is, even though it may not seem like it, birds and bread, I think is absolutely relevant to us today. That says a lot and speaks a very good word to our culture, to the busyness that we live in, and to how that busyness and how other things affect our worship. Maybe giving some insight into why we have relegated our worship to 3 songs before a sermon once a week, right? And I think the answer to those things are actually found in this story and a few others that we're going to look at this morning. But to really get everything out of the story, we have to go back and we have to see the story in light of the stories that surround it. Now, the problem is I don't have time to read all of those. I know that was a huge chunk. But I can tell you this, and so if you're interested in looking this up and reading it later on your own, I'm picking up in Exodus chapter 3, and this is running through Exodus chapter 16 is what we just read. So what has happened in the story up to this point is the nation of Israel, they didn't start as a nation, they started as a family that went down to Egypt, and they lived there for 400 years, a little over 400 years, and during that time, man, they were enslaved by the Egyptians. They were afraid of them. This slavery got worse and worse and worse over time until it was actually just this all-out genocide. And the people cried out to their God, the God of Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, the God of their forefathers. And God hears them, and he comes to their rescue, and he redeems them out. He buys them away from the Egyptians, and in a way that only God can do it, right? He brings these plagues. You've probably heard of this story or at least seen the movie, right? I think they're getting ready to play it all day on, I forget, the 10 Commandments. I don't know which channel they play that on, but they used to play the 10 Commandments where they would tell the Exodus story. It was every year on Thanksgiving. But anyways, and so God does this. He brings them out of Egypt, and they're traveling through the wilderness, 2 to 3 million people strong. And they get out in the wilderness, and Pharaoh there in Egypt decides to change his mind. He says, you're not leaving. You're definitely not leaving after the mess you just made in our country. And so they chase after them. He gathers his army, and they take off after the Israelites. And they come to the edge of the Red Sea where it looks like all hope is lost because they have the Red Sea on one side, and they have Pharaoh and his army bearing down on them on the other side. And then something miraculous happens. You probably know the story. God parts the Red Sea. The Israelites walk through on dry ground. And then as soon as the Egyptians go in, God brings the Red Sea back down on top of them and drowns the entire army and everyone there in it. So that's the story up to Exodus chapter 14, right? And it tells the story. And so if you want to read the Red Sea story, then go back to Exodus chapter 14 and read it. But what you're going to notice if you read one more chapter, Exodus chapter 15, is it completely retells the whole Red Sea story again. But if you look in your Bible, the indentation is probably a little different. The typeface may all be bolded, or it may all be uppercase letters or something, some way that it denotes that this isn't just a narrative anymore, that this is now poetry and this is music. That they actually go back and they sing the first corporate worship song, the Israelites do. And it's about how amazing and how great God is and the great power that he has shown and how thankful they are for him redeeming them out of the land. Like this is an amazing moment that the entire nation gathers around and sings this song of worship, right? And we're going to pick up at the end of chapter 15. Here's what it says. Miriam, she is Moses' wife. She answered them, sing to the Lord. This is the last verse of that worship song. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. And they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. Now let's just stop for just a second. God has been through an incredible ordeal up to this point, bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, right? Like he has decimated the most powerful nation in the world up to that point. And he brings them out, he parts the Red Sea, he destroys an army, and they go out into the wilderness, and they find no water. And we know that this turns really nasty, right? Because they come to Marah. They could not drink the waters at Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And we know, out of context in some other passages that talk about this, that they didn't just grumble, that they actually outright threatened to kill Moses over this incident. That he just led this entire nation 3 days into the wilderness. They couldn't go any farther without people starting to drop dead from dehydration, and they couldn't turn around and go backwards because they were too far to do that either, right? That they were in a place that if God didn't step in and do something that only God could do, which you would think at this point in their story, they would be kind of used to relying on him for, right? But instead, they grumble. So God fixes their problem. He gives them clean water to drink. And then the story continues on. This is in Exodus chapter 16. Just, again, a couple of verses later. And here's what happens. So the sons of Israel said to them, "Would that we have died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt." Listen to this. "When we sat by the pots of meat." Now they're not thirsty, right? Now Pharaoh's army isn't bearing down on them. Now they're hungry. And man, would we just have died there in Egypt? We would have just rather died in Egypt because at least we were sitting by pots of meat, right? And when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. And did you notice what just happened? How quickly the Israelites were to go back and worship the God of their bellies and their comfort, right? Did you notice that they were willing to sacrifice their freedoms, their comforts, and even their own lives for a steady source of food? And there is no such thing as a failure to worship. I like what John Calvin says. He says, "Man's nature is a perpetual factory of idols, such that as the mind begets an idol, the hands give birth to it, and the heart worships it." No, there's no such thing as a failure to worship. There is only worship at the feet of the wrong God, right? So that brings us back to the bread and the birds. Worship always involves some form of sacrifice, right? They were ready to go back to Egypt and face the consequences. In fact, multiple times they say throughout their story, not just here, but in other parts that come later on, that they would just rather go back to Egypt, that they're going to find a new leader, they're going to kick Moses out, and let's just go back to Egypt and let's face the music there. They're going to kill some of us, sure, but at least we've got pots of meat and we've got enough bread to eat, right? They were good with dying either way, right? They just weren't good with dying out there in the wilderness. They wanted a good source of food. It was the God of comfort that they worshiped, right? They were happy being pigs led to the slaughter as long as they were happy pigs on their way there, right? So God takes the thing that they were willing to die in worship of, right? He takes the thing that they are willing to sacrifice their very lives for, and he uses it to point back to him. He says, "Man, food, I can do food. I can take care of your needs for food," right? 2 to 3 million people out in a desert. The God of the universe, he could have handled food any way he wanted to, right? He could have just magically made the desert spring up like fruit and just flow with all kinds of abundant things for them to eat. But he doesn't do that, does he? He brings food in this miraculous way that they don't even know what it is. In fact, this is the story of how manna, they got manna, and manna just means what is it, right? Because they didn't know what it was. God brings food to them in this miraculous way, in a way that only he can do it. But he points back to him. He uses the thing that they were willing to worship to turn their hearts back to the worship of the right God. And he says, don't take too much of it. Trust me, right? Live in faith that I will take care of you. Don't gather too much. Gather what you need for today. And again, this reaches back to something that we talked about 2 weeks ago, right? We don't have time to go back and explore that. But God is setting out this pattern. And what happens is if they go and they gather too much, or they try to keep some overnight in fear that maybe tomorrow the manna won't come, it rots and it grows foul and it breeds worms in it, right? And I think there's something in this, and I think there's something in our busy pursuit, in our busy lives, that we're a lot like the Israelites. We see the need to strive and to struggle and to scratch out a living, and so we work and we work and we work and we fill our schedules. And really, the time, just like our finances that we talked about a few weeks ago, tells a story. It tells a story about what we value, it tells a story about what we worship, ultimately. And God does something here on the sixth day that I think really shows us this. He says, tomorrow, the sixth day, I want you to gather twice as much, because tomorrow is going to be a Sabbath for you. And we need to stop here and we need to explore this if we're really going to understand what this passage is driving at. So, we have this word. That is Shabbat. Have you guys ever heard that word before? Maybe if you have some friends or relatives that are like Messianic Jews or just Jewish, maybe you've heard that word. We wouldn't say Shabbat. We would say Sabbath. That's sort of the English transliterated word. And all of these things just mean stop. That you're supposed to, on this day, it isn't to just stop for the sake of stopping and not working, right? It's not to be lazy. It actually has a purpose. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 31 says that it's to be a Sabbath, a solemn rest for you, that you may humble your souls. It's a permanent statue, right? This is sort of an expanded teaching on this idea of Sabbath and rest. And so it isn't just rest for the sake of rest. Here was sort of the idea that for 6 days you worked. But on that seventh day, you stopped. And specifically for them in this instance, it was to look to God as the provider. It was that they would stop and that they would trust God and that they wouldn't go out into the field looking for manna because there wouldn't be any there. But that God, just as he was faithful on days 1 through 6 to provide everything that they needed, that he who took a lot, he had enough. And the one who took little, he still had enough. That everyone had enough, and that God was there and he was providing for them. And more than that, like, he provided water. He provided like birds that just like washed up there at the camp that they just went out and picked up off the ground. Like, I can't imagine what that looked like, right? Like, He provided for their clothing, that their shoes and their clothes for 40 years as they wandered through the wilderness didn't wear out, right? Like, you don't think about that, but where did 3 million people go to get clothes? Like, not even like the Gap or whatever. Macy's could support that, right? Like that's a lot of people, and yet God provisioned and took care of them. And this Sabbath or this Shabbat was about stopping, and it was recognizing God for who he was and for what he had done. So that's 1 week right here. But it wasn't just over the course of a week. That every year there was another cycle. And there was these 7 feasts throughout the year. There was the Feast of Passover. Have you heard about this? The Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Just one example, the Tabernacles was this festival where you went out and you spent a week camping, essentially. And you went to the wilderness and you built these booths with your family and you lived out the Exodus story again. And the point of it was to bring your mind back to how God had redeemed and saved his people out of slavery and had provided for them, delivered them from the hands of the Egyptians. That it was a moment, and they all culminated or started on a Sabbath. That it was a time to stop and Shabbat, right? And that we would look back to who God is and what he's done, and we would worship him in light of that. And so that's on the year. And then not just on the year, but every 7 years, we stop again. And there's a Sabbath year where for an entire year, you don't work the land. That slaves are freed, some debts are forgiven, and the land is allowed to rest. And you say, well, how did they get food? Exactly. They rested and they didn't work the ground. They didn't farm anything. And the idea was that God would continue to perpetuate the crops and that he would provide for them. It was this forced moment to stop. Actually, this was a year that they were forced to stop and to lean on God for provision. And not just for the sake of leaning on God, but to look back to who he was, what he had done, and how he had provided to worship him. And then, just going even further out, every 7 sets of 7 years, God really likes the number 7, right? Every 7 sets of 7 years, so every 49 years was this like super jubilee, they would call it, the day of the jubilee year. And in this year, not only was the land allowed to rest, slaves were freed, all debts were forgiven. And in fact, if you had sold your property, maybe your grandpa had sold his property to someone else just to pay off a debt, that in this year, that land was returned to you. That, man, it was a year that we took care of the widow and the orphan and the foreigner among us, that it pointed back to, and it was this posture of worship as we connected with the character and nature of God and what he had done for us. And it was an entire year of worship. And in this, is rest. That the key to all of this is in stopping. And does anyone have a hard time with that? Yeah, I have an incredibly difficult time with this. This cycle of sevens, this cycle of work and of rest actually finds its roots in the creation narrative, and it's actually woven into all of creation itself. That for 6 days, God worked as he created the universe and everything in it. And on the 7th day, he rested from his work. And he enters into this sort of eternal rest. But here's the deal. We broke that system. That's the system that we were meant to live in, right? Is that we were meant to enter in and to live in this place of eternal rest. And what we did is we gathered too much, is we tried to keep some of it until morning, right? And it bred worms, and it became foul, and it rotted. And we live in a planet, we live in a world right now where we have tried to define our own kingdom. We have tried to do things our way, and we have failed to follow the commandments of God. And so we no longer get to rest from our work, right? God is the only one who rests from his work. We now get to rest for our work. And that's actually an incredibly important distinctive, because it drives us to this place of hope and longing for that eternal rest that is found only in the Father, and that is only found when we look to him. Rest is meant to turn our hearts in worship back to the God who creates, redeems, blesses, loves, and offers ultimately that true rest. Now here's the scary thing. Israel lived in the land for nearly 800 years, and for around 490 of those years, they completely disregarded God's commandment to observe that Sabbath rest. That they didn't do any of this, right? They didn't do the year of Jubilee. Like, there's no indication that this ever happened, that they ever returned land to its owners, that they ever did this, and that they ever followed through with what God had actually commanded them to do. And because of this, and other reasons that are directly tied to Israel's worship, God sent them into exile for 70 years. That's the exact amount of rest that they had not given the land. And so God had exacted that rest from them in order that it would turn their hearts back to him. During that time that they failed to rest, during that 490 years, they sank into some wild idolatry, man. They sacrificed their own kids on these altars to these other gods. Detestable practices of worship that are just like hard to believe that they're actually in the Bible, and that people actually engaged in those things. But I believe that this is actually a shocking but very real commentary on the depths that our hearts will sink to if they are not engaged in true rest and therefore true worship of God, where we recognize him for who he is and what he has done and how he is continually working in our lives. Now here's the deal. You're probably thinking that that's like pretty terrible, right? You're not at any risk of sacrificing your own children on the altar of worship, right, to another God, and you're probably right? What often happens, though, is actually quite sinister in its own right, though. And I think we see that over in the New Testament, Mark chapter 2. So let's read there and let's continue on this conversation about rest and worship. Up to this point, Mark chapter 2, Jesus has had some run-ins with the religious leaders of his day. Now, these guys had taken this, and they had seen what had happened and what had led the nation to be carted off into exile, and they said, never again, right? We're going to observe all of these things. And so they had erected all of these laws around the Sabbath day to make sure that you actually rested. Like there were a certain number of steps that you could take. Like you couldn't put in false teeth on the Sabbath day. That was actually a rule that they had. That there were like these crazy amount of rules. I heard one commentary say there was like over 300 different rules just specifically about the Sabbath day. That's not any of these other things that were going on, but just that one day of the week that they were supposed to stop and rest, that there were all of these laws and things that they couldn't do. Like you couldn't wash your hands for too long. And you had to wash your hands because that was part of like the worship ceremony. And so it becomes this convoluted mess. And one day they see some of Jesus' disciples and they're walking through this field and it's a Sabbath day and they pick a head of grain. They pick some grain out of the field and they rub it between their hands and they eat some of the grain and they see them and it's like, oh no, like these are Jesus' disciples. You can't do that, right? That's breaking the Sabbath law. And the reality was it wasn't breaking the Sabbath law, right? Like they were literally walking with God as they were doing that. But for them, it had broke their traditions. And then it goes on, and there's this sort of showdown in Mark chapter 2 where Jesus heals this man on the Sabbath day. And there's an exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, and here's how the exchange ends. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Jesus says to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was for you to stop and to reflect on and to worship God. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And Jesus tells them, man, you've missed the point. And if you were truly following the Sabbath and you understood what it was about and what it was pointing to ultimately in Jesus, right? And you were engaged in actual true worship of the Father, you would then recognize me for who I am, but you have missed it. And you don't see what I'm doing, right? So this is the point of the sermon where I say, so what's the answer, right? How does the gospel move us to truly worship? How do we not miss what this is about? How do we not make our time of worship just relegated to Sunday mornings where, we sing 3 songs and we come and we listen to a sermon? I think the picture that the Bible paints to us is these regular rhythms of intentionally stopping from our work to rely on God, to lean into him, and to think back on what he has done and how he has worked in our life and is continuing to work in our life. But what is it that pushes us to do that? What's the answer to that? And this is where we're going to close out in Acts, in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 13. We see Paul, and he's on his first missionary journey. And he comes to Perga. And they arrived at Pisidian Antioch. This is Acts 13, 14 through 16. And on the Sabbath day, right, they go into the synagogue and they sat down. So Paul and some of his co-travelers that are with him, they go and they know that they're going to find people that don't know Jesus at the synagogue. And they go on a Sabbath, this day of worship, and they sat down. And after reading the law, this is common practice, right? In the prophets, the synagogue officials sent to them saying, "Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it." Again, this was fairly common practice, that they would read these big chunks of Scripture and then they would just stop and some people would make some commentary over this, and if anyone in the audience had something that they wanted to say, they would say something about it. And Paul stood up, and motioning with his hand, he said, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen." And you can read in your Bible what happens after this, but essentially, Paul goes on and he retells everything that I just talked to you about. How God leads the Israelites out of Egypt. How he establishes them in the land. How he raises up King David, and he promises that through David there will never lack a king on the throne. That through David, the true Savior and hope of Israel, the Redeemer and the Messiah, will one day come. And it seems a little out of context, again, unless you take into account that Paul is teaching on the Sabbath, right? He's pointing them back to all that God had done for Israel and how God and how all that God was doing pointed back to Jesus. That like everything that God was doing, these acts of redemption, that how he had provided for, was ultimately pointing to Jesus and his work on our behalf. And then Paul goes on and he gives the gospel in this really big way. You can again read this. It tells about his life, his death, and his resurrection. And they were all being looked forward to during the times of rest. Like they were supposed to be in these times looking forward to. And if they had actually been engaging in this, and not just religious practice, right, on a specific day of the week, but if they had actually been engaging in true worship, that they would have recognized, they would have realized who Jesus was and what he was doing. And here's how Paul finishes his teaching in Acts 13. Verse 38 and 39. It says, "Therefore, let it be known to you, brethren, that through him, Jesus, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And through him, everyone who believes is freed from all things from which you could not be freed through the law of Moses." And through Jesus, we get to enter into that eternal rest with the Father. Like true, actual rest. That, man, it isn't through an act of striving or working harder or doing more. It's actually stopping and resting in who Jesus is and what he's done on our behalf on the cross and through his death and through his resurrection, that we actually get to enter into rest. And man, this is amazing. This is like really good news, but actually it pulls at everything in us, because everything in us wants to work and work and work and try and do more and more and more, right? And when we see things beginning to slip, what do we do then, man? We just knuckle down and we try even harder and we just grind it out even more, right? Man, this is me. Like, there's so much to do right now. There is a building. There is all these things. There are people who have real needs that need attention. And like, you're no different. Like, you have things. You have people that need you. You have big, significant things that you are engaged in, man. And our tendency is to work, and try harder. But at the end of the day, I'm going back and I'm choosing the wrong path there in the garden once again. I'm choosing to, instead of entering into God's rest and stopping and looking to him and allowing him to define good and evil and to enter into the rest that only he can provide, I try to make my own way. And that isn't rest at all. In fact, God tells me that the harder I scratch and claw my way for an existence, that it's only going to produce thorns and thistles. That he is the only one that can spring a garden up out of the wilderness. And it's as I try harder and harder and harder. Man, and here's how it typically starts, is that Monday morning, I start with the best of intentions, that I'm going to stop throughout the week, and that I'm going to have true rest, and I'm going to engage in actual, like, worship of the Father. And I'm going to actually stop, and I'm going to, like, really dive in and worship this week, and I'm going to take some time with my family. We're going to do this. And then what I find come like Sunday afternoon is I haven't done any of that. And what am I, man? Am I like better off for that? Like, what have I actually gained when I fail to do that? And the answer is nothing. That I look at my hands at the end of the week, when that is what my week has looked like, And it is a bowl of rotten, foul, worm-filled manna. And man, I have tried to do something like apart from God and under my own strength. Man, and not only have I failed to rest, but in this, like my heart gets drug away to the idol of self. And that it's me and my strength, right? Or it's my job, or it's my things, or it's my like satisfaction, or my comfort, or my whatever, right? That ultimately sustains me and is worthy of my sacrifice and ultimately my worship. But that's not it. And that God has proven that he can do more in 6 days than I can do in a lifetime. So I should give him the seventh, right? I should rest and I should take that time and lean into him. And in that, experience true worship. You know, at the Outpost, like we were very intentional about that name. That an outpost, man, it's the last place at the edge of the wilderness that you visit for equipping and for training before a journey into the wilderness, right? And we would say that we are that we want to equip you for the work of mission, right? As we engage in the mission of Jesus in our city and ultimately in our world. And we're going to give you the tools. We're going to give you the food and the resources that you need to go out. And it isn't just an expedition to see if you can get to the top of Everest, right? It's not that. That our expedition is decidedly a rescue mission and that we equip you for that. And it isn't just the last place you visit before you go into the wilderness, but it's the first place you come back to as you come out of the wilderness for rest and for refuge. And especially as you bring people back with you, that this is the place that they would come and that they would find rest, that they would have their needs met, that they would be served, and that they would experience God's love and his provision and his grace and his redemption and all the things that he has given us, right? That we would be that place. But in order for us to be that place, man, we have to be engaging in this as individuals. And so the question is will you commit to a pattern of rest for the sake of true worship? And I don't say that in hopes of a bolstered attendance on a Sunday service. I say that in hopes that you would take time throughout your week, very intentionally with your family, by yourself, with others, with other people in our church and other people around you, like that you would take time to intentionally stop and clear the space in the margins of your life that you can engage in real rest. Because just like our finances, what we do with our time, with our efforts, they tell a story about who we actually trust and who we have put our trust and our hope in. And man, if we have truly believed and we have truly committed to following Jesus, that, man, I don't know if you saw that back in Leviticus chapter 16, but this is something that goes on forever, that the Sabbath didn't end. Now, it doesn't mean that we take the Saturday or the Sabbath, right? But it just means that this principle of stopping and resting in worship goes on forever. And forever means forever, like in eternity. That there will be a day where we will engage in that final, ultimate rest. But man, if we want to be that as a church, and we want people to experience that and to experience true worship. Man, not that 3 songs before a sermon isn't good, right? It has its place. It's an amazing expression and a beautiful expression of worship. But that's just not our only expression of worship. That's not the depth of our worship, that we're called to so much more. And I hope that you will engage in this and hope that you will enter into the conflict, because it is a conflict. Because everything in us, everything in me, pulls against this, and it pulls at, man, I just want to try harder. I want to do more. I want to work, right? Because there's stuff to get done. And so I don't know. The best I can offer you is this right now. And actually, I think it's pretty good. I think that this is what God calls us to, and I think that this is the hope that we find in Jesus, and that is true rest in the Father. Will you pray with me? Father God, we just thank you for your Son. We just thank you for the rest that is offered us in Jesus. And Father, I just pray that we would Shabbat this week. We would stop and we would look back to you and what you have done, what you're continuing to do, and how you're working in our lives right now, Father, that you are good, good Father. Lord, we love you. We praise you. We take time to praise you